Okay, so this is the phylum Arthropoda. And arthro means jointed, and in this case, it is the organisms that have jointed appendages or jointed feet. So these have jointed appendages. These organisms are also segmented. So in insects, for example, we might have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. So we see that compared to like annelids, they have reduced segments, and the segments have fused and they have become specialized. So the head, for example, consists of segments that had appendages that became fused, and those appendages include the antennae, but they also, in many cases, would include the feeding mouth parts. So you have mandibles and you have maxillas and you have all these little appendages near the mouth, and those are jointed. The thorax might have walking legs coming off of it. If we're talking like about a grasshopper, you can imagine the jointed appendages coming off of it. And then the abdomen is also segmented when you look at it, say, for example, at a grasshopper. So this is just an example. Some of the segmentations are different. When we look at spiders and we look at crustaceans like crabs and lobsters and shrimp, they would have a different number, and their segments might be called something else. So this is an example. This would be in insects. So one thing that these organisms have that is very interesting is an exoskeleton. So this is different than an endoskeleton. We have an endoskeleton. Our skeleton is on the inside. The exoskeleton is like armor that is on the outside of the body, and it is composed of a type of carbohydrate called chitin. This is a sugar. This is like starch. This is like cellulose. So this is a carbohydrate. We cannot digest this carbohydrate. And so it would just be fiber in our diet if we, for example, decided to eat the whole shrimp, including the exoskeleton. That would be the chitin. We cannot break it down and release glucose and use it to produce energy. So when we look at the exoskeleton is interesting because it must be shed in order for the organism to grow. Okay, the organism to grow. And the shedding of the exoskeleton is called ecdysis or molting. So it's ecdysis or molting. So this leaves them actually very vulnerable, right? During that period of time when they're shedding their exoskeleton, they actually are very soft-bodied. So if I look at my hard outer exoskeleton, let's say I'm talking about a grasshopper or a spider or even a pill bug, this is the hard outer, and it is old. So it's the old exoskeleton. That should be old with a D, old. Okay. The newer inner one is produced, and it initially is very soft. So this is new and soft. It is folded up because it's going to be bigger eventually. And so it actually has to break open. The old one has to break open, and you probably have seen insects like dragonflies extricating them from the hard outer exoskeleton. They pull themselves out, and then they are soft. And so that actually makes them pretty vulnerable to predation. So this could actually be an example of maybe perhaps a disadvantage to having an exoskeleton. So I'm going to say that this is a disadvantage. Let's look at an advantage. An advantage is that it is protective when you're not molting, And it also protects against water loss. So the first animals to colonize the terrestrial environment were arthropods. So they were able to come up and colonize this environment when we look in the fossil record. And a problem with being a terrestrial organism is that you are always subject to water loss. And so this aids the exoskeleton, helps to prevent that. Another disadvantage to having an exoskeleton is it is heavy. And so the organism can't actually get too big. We do not see giant grasshoppers or giant beetles crawling around on the planet because there is a limit. So another disadvantage I'll put up here, it also includes weight, because it is heavy relative to having an endoskeleton, which tends to be lighter. And so if we look at the bigger, more heavily armored organisms like lobsters and like crabs, they are aquatic because the aquatic environment helps to keep them buoyant. Okay, so let's look at the groups of arthropods. So this is a huge phylum. And so we generally don't talk about classes in this particular instance. We talk about subphyla. So this would be under the phyla. We can talk about subphyla. And so we can talk about those that are hexapoda. Hexapoda, six-legged. What arthropods are six-legged? These are the insects, for example. Six-legged creatures. We can talk about the chelicerates or chelicerata. What was an example of a chelicerata? This is an organism that has chelicerae, which are modified appendages that can be like fangs. And so this would be like the spiders, for example. Chelicerata is the spiders. So this is an example. Contains other groups, but that's the major example that I'm going to talk about. We also talk about the crustaceans. Ooh, this is lots of examples of this. This would be like shrimp. This would be like crab. This would be like lobster. Ooh, crayfish would be one that we have in our rivers. And then we also have like zooplankton. A lot of the zooplankton are crustaceans, like tiny little Daphne or tiny little shrimp, and they form the basis of many of our food webs in the aquatic environment. So like krill would be another example. So like we could have large whales surviving on krill, but krill also make up the food chain for that eventually leads to things like dolphins. Okay. So that would be a major group. All of the crustaceans are marine except for, oh, this is a good one, pill or sow bugs. Those are kind of different, but those are actually terrestrial crustaceans that you might have in your backyard. Okay. So we also have more kind of simple arthropods, groups of arthropods. So we could talk about the Myriapoda. And the Myriapoda include centipedes, which have lots of segments, and these tend to be carnivorous. So when you're digging around in your garden soil, you might find a centipede. Each segment has just one set of appendages, 100 feet, right? They have poison glands. They might bite you in some instances, but it's kind of like a bee sting. It's not that bad. And then we have centipedes. We have millipedes, which have actually fused segments. And so they actually have like 2 sets of jointed appendages on each segment. And these tend to be herbivorous. These are 2 things that you might find in your garden. Obviously, in more temperate environments, like in rainforests, these might get bigger. So you might see giant millipedes, for example. So these are the major groups of arthropods that you need to be familiar with.